now, which is great. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's program. I'm Janie Adams. I'm the History Engagement Manager for the Arizona Historical Society and a staff historian. I'm also an associate editor for the Journal of Arizona History. A little bit of some background information about the Society before we get started with today's program. The Arizona Historical Society is a nonprofit educational and cultural institution and a state agency established in 1864. AHS collects, preserves, and tells the story of Arizona's past through museum exhibits, libraries and collections, outreach, educational programs, and through publications. AHS preserves our past, shares our state stories, and connects people through the power of Arizona's history. Support for programming like this comes in part from membership dues. So if this is the kind of programming that you would like to see from the Society, consider becoming a member. Members get free admission to AHS museums, special members only events and members pricing for program, print copies of the Journal of Arizona History, and so much more. If you're interested in membership, you can visit us online at azhs.org. And in addition to all the things, membership, programming, museums, libraries and archives, collections, all that stuff, you can learn about all the things that the Society does, azhs.org. Some reminders for today's session. This is a Zoom webinar, so Dr. Crandall and I cannot see or hear you. But if you have questions or comments, please use the Q&A feature for those. This is a series commemorating 250 years of American history through an Arizona lens. The next program in the series is about morphine during the Arizona territorial period, and that will be actually next week, same time, same place. And then later in March, we will have a program on the progressive era in Arizona. So that one will also be very good. All right, and without further ado, I'm going to introduce Dr. Maurice Crandall. Dr. Crandall is a citizen of the Yavapai-Apache Nation of Camp Verde and an associate professor of history at Arizona State University. He is finishing a book on Yavapai and Apache former U.S. Army Indian Scouts and is published widely on the history of Arizona and the greater U.S. Mexico Borderlands. He is currently an American Council of Learned Societies Fellow. Dr. Crandall, thank you so much for being here with us today.
All right, thank you for that introduction. Happy to be here. Thanks to the people who are joining during their lunch break. It's a pleasure to address all of you. I think that introduction pretty much said everything that needed to be said. Let's see if there's anything to add. I don't think so. Maybe as a little background on this talk, in conversation with the good folks at the Arizona Historical Society, I've worked with them on numerous occasions in the past, and it's always been a pleasure and gone well. And so we're talking about this series and also some potential topics. And one of the things that I've been thinking about, and maybe you all or others have been thinking about as we commemorate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence and the birth of the United States, was what was going on in Arizona during that time. What was going on in places other than the original 13 states, 13 colonies on the eastern seaboard? Was this an important time for areas other than the United States at that time? So obviously we know that Arizona didn't exist in 1776 and thereabouts. It would be quite a while before Arizona as a place came into being. But there were people here, obviously, and there were things happening. And while 1776 might not have the same significance in Arizona that it had in a place like Philadelphia or New York or along the eastern seaboard, there were important things happening during that time. And in addition, I've decided for my approach for this talk today to sort of broaden my view, to go back a couple of decades and to go forward a couple of decades and talk about this as the era of the American Revolution more broadly. And then we get a better view of what was going on in Arizona at that time. And also we see that it was an important time. It was a consequential time during which important things for the history of this region going forward happened, and a lot of influential things that would have an impact on the future history of Arizona. And we can see some of the roots of things that we observe today or in our more recent history, even going back to the latter part of the 18th century and the era of the American Revolution. So that's a little bit of background. I'm going to share my PowerPoint. Title of my talk today is Revolutionary Arizona. And I'm going to examine the era of the American Revolution through three things. And I'll sort of start chronologically. First, with what has come to be known as the Pima Revolt of 1751. Again, that's a full 25 years before the beginning of the American Revolution, but it is during that revolutionary era. And just as we would connect the French and Indian War to the American Revolution as being very important to what happens 20, 25 years later, in the same way, this has an important influence on Arizona at that time. So if we look at a map of what was then called Pimeria Alta, or the land of the Upper Pimas, we can see that the line of Spanish settlement during that time doesn't extend farther north than Tucson. So Tucson is the northernmost line of settlement for Spaniards in this region. There were a number of missions and communities around and south of Tucson, and you can see all of those on this map. These missions primarily ministered to O'odham people, who at the time were known as Pimas and Papagos. Now, we should talk a little bit about O'odham. So the O'odham means the people, and they inhabited this, as you see on the map, this region that encompassed Pimeria Alta. A number of missions were there. They spoke a language that's part of the Uto-Aztecan family. Historically, they had an enormous homeland in the southwest that extended south to Sonora, Mexico, north into central Arizona. To where I'm at, there were Akimel O'odhams or river O'odhams. And then south of here, around Tucson, you had the Thana O'odhams, who are the desert O'odhams. And their territory went west all the way to the Gulf of California and east to the San Pedro River. This has been the homeland of O'odham peoples since time immemorial. They lived mostly in dispersed communities, villages. This is a pretty harsh desert landscape. Many visitors would have just assumed continue right on through there. But for O'odhams, this was a homeland, and it provided all the things that they needed. They hunted deer and antelope, for example. They engaged in agriculture, gathered edible foods like saguaro fruit and agave. They were experts and continue to be experts on how to survive in this desert landscape. Their traditional enemies were Apaches. So I'm Western Apache. These are the traditional enemies of the O'odhams during that time. And I'll talk more about Apaches later in this talk, but O'odhams and Apaches battled frequently and violently, and at times each group took captives from the other group, sometimes incorporated them into their societies. So there was a captive taking practice between the two groups. And violence between O'odhams and Apaches increased with the entry of Spaniards into the region because it brought increased livestock and access to goods, etc. And all of this caused an increase in competition for these goods, and there was increased violence. Again, like I said, this region was known as the Pimeria Alta. This is the area around the current U.S. Mexico border. And it was a Jesuit missionary by the name of Eusebio Francisco Kino, who opened up this area to Catholic missionization beginning in 1687. He was known as the Padre on horseback because he rode a horse widely in this area as he established these mission communities. And this is a photo of a statue of Kino, the Padre on horseback in Magdalena del Kino, which is in Mexico. I took this photograph down there as I went and visited some of these communities. Just for fun, as I went up closer to the statue, you could see somebody wrote Andy on his foot, like a little nod to Toy Story there. But it was Father Kino who set in motion the missionization of O'odham peoples. And by the early 1700s, there were a number of missions established. We look at this map. O'odham missions, including San Javier del Bac, which is close to Tucson, Guevavi, Dolores, Cucurpe, San Ignacio, Caborca, Titoa, Pitiquito, many, many missions in this area. And the O'odhams who were brought into these missions or who moved to these missions, and they had various reasons for living there. Some of it was done forcefully. Some O'odhams used them as sort of seasonal places where they would go and live for a time and then leave the missions and go live back in the countryside. Spaniards called those who they had brought into the missions as Native people who had been reduced. That was the term they used. They actually called the missions reducciones. But those who came to live in the missions were required to, the Spaniards wanted them to adopt a Spanish lifestyle, Catholicism, take up Spanish life ways, farm in the manner that Spaniards saw as the proper mode of agriculture. But they also required O'odhams at the missions to participate in warfare against Apaches and other groups who were not allied with Spaniards. And O'odhams were adept soldiers. For the Spaniards, who were never numerically very large in the region, O'odhams provided a lot of manpower, and they relied on O'odham warriors in their warfare against other indigenous groups. They never would have been able to do it on their own without O'odham help. So when Spaniards required that O'odhams participate in a campaign in the fall of 1751 against Apaches, this would not have been anything out of the ordinary. And this is what precipitates the Pima Revolt of 1751, as it's called. This is one of the missions, just to show you what they looked like. This photo I also took at Tumacacori mission, which became a Franciscan mission after a transition to the Franciscan order, but it was originally a Jesuit mission. And you can go to a number of these missions, both in southern Arizona and more in northern Mexico. So as I said, there was this requirement that O'odham soldiers participate in this campaign against Apaches in 1751. This was nothing out of the ordinary. This was a typical request. And at the head of the force of O'odham auxiliaries was a guy with this, for me, incredibly difficult name to pronounce. I always mess it up. But his name was Luis Oaxpicahigua. I'll just call him Luis O, or Luis of Sarik. He was the O'odham governor of the village community of Sarik. And he also, because he had been a good warrior, Spaniards had found him trustworthy. He had proven himself in battle on a number of occasions. He was appointed to be the captain general of the Upper Pimas in this region. So he was supposed to lead this force of O'odham soldiers. And when the call to battle came, he made his way toward the action with his forces. He and his large group were supposed to head north and rendezvous with a Spanish officer, the captain of the Spanish Presidio of Terrenate. So Luis and his men passed through the mission village of Guevavi, where the Jesuit father there, whose name was Joseph Garrucho, welcomed them. He fed them, personally interacted with Luis, entertained him in his own mission quarters, and showed him respect. He also gave the O'odham soldiers 15 head of cattle to take with them as supplies and food. And so Luis and his forces sort of expected this type of treatment. They were on a mission, a military mission, that the Spaniards were the ones behind it, and so they expected that they would be respected by the Spaniards and by those at the missions that they encountered. But as Luis and his forces went to the other another mission community at Suamca, they were not received in the same way. The Jesuit missionary there was a guy by the name of Ignacio Keller, who was had a different attitude toward the Othams and this group of soldiers of Otham auxiliaries. Father Keller was born in Moravia, which is now part of the Czech Republic. And he looked at Luis and insulted him for his clothing and his weapons. To Father Keller, Luis's appearance was overbearing, and he essentially asked him, who do you think you are, dressing like a Spaniard and carrying a gun? He called him a Chichimec dog, and he told Luis that he should use a bow and arrow and be wearing a breechcloth because these were more appropriate for an Indian soldier. Overall, Keller was incredibly insulting and condescending to Luis. And I remind you, Luis was Captain General of the Otham forces in the region. So he should have been shown at least the minimal respect. In addition, Father Keller told Luis that he had no right to command men from other villages. He said, "You're not the captain of Tres Alamos or Santa Maria or Cocospera. These are not your sons." Basically, he was saying, don't ask for Othams from my mission to join you. And the reason for that is that he wanted those Othams for labor at that mission, in the mission fields, and in the work that he was having them do. While Jesuit missionaries were not supposed to gain wealth from their efforts, they did gain land and resources and goods and basically enrich the Catholic Church and sometimes themselves through their labor. So he didn't want the Othams there at his mission to join this auxiliary force, essentially. It would seem that Luis was insulted enough that he went home and abandoned the military campaign that he and his men were supposed to be on. And according to one source, who was a captured Otham spy after the fact who testified on the events of the revolt, Luis was not happy with his position as Captain General because he thought that it would bring him the respect of the Jesuits. This was not the case, and he was reported to have said, "I do not want these arms or this uniform. It's better that we should live with our liberty. Now I will betray the Spaniards." These are the words that were attributed to him. He probably didn't obviously say that exact thing, but he did begin to plan a revolt and believe that it was time for Otham peoples to be liberated from Spaniards and from the Jesuits at the missions in particular. And so from his home community at Sadik, he planned this revolt against the Spaniards. He sent out runners who went to the communities and asked for people's support. There was no centralized authority among Otham communities, so it's not like there was a central government where they could plan this. He had to convince all of these independent Otham communities to join. Some did and some did not. And in this case, we can see some similarity between what was going on during the 1770s in the 13 colonies, which become the 13 states. There was not a complete unity of opinion. There were those who stayed loyal to the British, the loyalists versus the patriots. And so there's some similarity, some limited similarity. I don't want to say this is a one-to-one comparison, but Luis was trying to convince a vast array of Otham communities to join this revolt. And there were some who did not join, who didn't want to join in. And it was a difficult task that he had, but he was fairly successful. And like I said, he sent these runners out in all directions, telling Othams to take their families and their possessions to the Bawakivari Mountains, which are sacred to Otham people. Some to the north, who were divided over the revolt, were unwilling to accept this plan. And some were sympathetic to the Spaniards and alerted authorities to the planned revolt. And so in some cases, Spaniards and Jesuits were able to seek safety away from the O'odham communities and missions and escape being killed or expelled from the region. But the revolt began on Saturday, November 20th, 1751. The Jesuit priest of Sarek, who was a guy by the name of Juan Nentvig, had been tipped off about the revolt, and he hightailed it out of there just in the nick of time and escaped with his life. But Luis and his group purportedly lured a group of 18 Spanish settlers, among them children, into Luis's house under the guise that Apaches were about to attack and they needed to shelter there. This wouldn't have been out of the ordinary, as Apaches did sometimes attack their communities. But once the people were inside, the doors were barred and the house was set on fire. The people inside burned alive, and those that tried to escape, bursting out through the burning structure, were clubbed to death by O'odhams waiting outside for them. There was similar fighting and flare-ups that happened throughout the course of November 20th and 21st at other communities. A lot of villages did revolt, and by the next day, Sunday evening, 109 people, most of them Spaniards, had been killed. Many Spaniards fled and escaped with their lives, and the survivors congregated at the Terrenato Presidio. There were also a number of O'odhams who, like I said, didn't join the revolt. Some of them hid out in the Santa Rita Mountains or at Tres Alamos on the San Pedro River. But for a relatively brief period in late 1751, Spaniards feared that the entire province there of Pimeria Alta would be lost. This was their worst nightmare because this had happened in 1680 in New Mexico with the Pueblo Revolt, where the entire province of New Mexico was lost for a time. And that lasted over 10 years that Spaniards had been expelled from New Mexico. And so they were fearful that the same thing was happening. I want to make a few points about this revolt. We use the word revolt, but for the O'odhams who lived there, for them, this was a liberation struggle. They were trying to free themselves from oppressors at the missions, the Jesuit missionaries, and also the Spanish civil and military authorities who ruled over them. So they were fighting for their freedom. It was not a war of just complete rampage where O'odhams killed Spaniards and every Spaniard and sympathizers that they encountered. There was extreme violence in some cases, but in other cases, they wanted the Spaniards to leave, which a lot did. They fled the region. But in some cases, just as had happened in the Pueblo Revolt, the Jesuits at the missions, as had happened with the Franciscans at the missions in New Mexico, were killed. Tomas Tello, for example, was the Jesuit priest at Caborca. He was murdered by another man named Luis, who was the captain of war in that town, and Luis of Sarek's sort of right-hand man. At that mission community, the people who lived there had suffered whippings and punishments from Tomas Tello, and they didn't like that. And so they killed him at that mission. At the mission of Sonoita, the Jesuit father and two others were killed as well. But the initial success of the revolt did not last. It was short-lived. And Luis and his forces were defeated on January 5th, 1752. So just a couple months later, less than 2 months later, actually. And the revolt lost steam. They tried to flee into the mountains. And then Luis entered into negotiations with the governor of Sonora. The Jesuits were not happy about this. One of Luis's demands was the removal of Father Keller at the mission of Soamca, who had insulted him. On March 18th of 1752, Luis surrendered to Captain Joseph Diaz del Carpio at Tubac, and he was granted amnesty. Obviously, the Jesuits were not happy about that, but Spanish officials were just happy to see the violence end. By April 1752, O'odhams were returning to the missions, and life kind of went back to some semblance of normal. Father Keller was called before the viceroy in Mexico City, and he defended himself there. Not surprisingly, he was returned to his mission in the spring of 1753, so he wasn't really punished. Nothing happened to him. Luis, on the other hand, was imprisoned and made to perform penance before Spanish authorities and missionaries. Eventually died in prison in 1756, and his right-hand man, Luis, the other Luis, purportedly tried to commit suicide while he was imprisoned. And then we don't know what happened to him after that. It's possible that he was executed or that he was released or died in custody as well. Interestingly, while the revolt was short-lived, the violence and warfare did continue. Two of Luis of Saric's sons carried on with the guerrilla war, basically, against the Spaniards. And there was a sort of a loose confederation of O'odham and Seri Indian forces that joined together. And for almost 20 years, they continued on a protracted guerrilla war against the Spaniards. And this led to further instability in the region. In particular, it weakened the stance of the Jesuits in Sonora, who were seen as not being able to control the situation there. And they were eventually expelled from the province in 1767. Not only there was a Jesuit expulsion throughout. It was a global expulsion where Jesuits who were seen as not loyal to the Spanish crown, but more loyal to the Catholic Church and Rome, their orders were expelled from these New World missions. But this is just to show that during this time, there were indigenous revolts, there was unrest, there were people who were unhappy with the system as it existed, and initiated their own freedom struggles against Spaniards, somewhat similar to what happens with American colonists to the east, although they're not indigenous peoples. And so there's, again, it's not a one-to-one comparison. I'm not saying that their freedom struggle was the same. These were people here in Arizona and in northern Mexico fighting for their homelands, fighting for their indigenous homelands in the place where they had lived since time immemorial. So that's the Pima Revolt of 1751. That's the first lens through which I want to examine what was going on in Arizona during the Revolutionary era. The next one is the expeditions of Domínguez and Escalante, and then the Anza expedition, which happened just about the same time. So first, there was the Domínguez-Escalante expedition of 1776. This is right during the time of the Declaration of Independence and American Revolution. This is a depiction of the expedition as it reaches a mountainous area in what's today Utah, guided by an indigenous guide. It was led by two Franciscan priests, Atanasio Domínguez and Silvestre Vélez de Escalante. They were tasked with finding a route from Santa Fe, New Mexico to the coastal mission of Monterey, Alta California. The expedition traveled through portions of what would later become Arizona, Utah, and Colorado. They also brought with them the famous cartographer Bernardo de Miera y Pacheco, who mapped the expedition's travels, and these maps became important to future expeditions and travelers and settlers. This expedition was actually relatively small in number. I mean, if you compare it to the Coronado expedition of the 1540s, Domínguez and Escalante only had 10 members in their party. They were not going as a conquering army. They were not there to colonize or settle. They were there to try to map a route from Santa Fe to California. They never actually made it to California. They were guided by indigenous peoples at various points, although at other times they lacked guides and they got lost or they wandered around. They traveled to areas that were unknown to Spaniards at the time, although not unknown to the indigenous groups who lived there. But you can see their route as they left Santa Fe and went north and west and then headed along this route through Colorado, into Utah. They made it to Utah Lake. They were famously guided by three Timpanogos Ute guides. They did not go to Salt Lake. And as they were there in the fall, of 1776, it started to get cold. There was snowfall even in the fall up there in what's today Utah. And so they headed south. They made the decision not to continue on to California. So you see their route as they went south. They made it down to the Colorado River, but they didn't have guides at that point, and so they sort of were looking for a place to cross. If you know about the Colorado River, there are not always ready crossings, and so they had a difficult time finding a place to cross the river. They traveled through what is now Glen Canyon. Eventually, they found a place to cross the river, although they had to carve steps into the canyon walls so that they and their animals could safely make it down to the river crossing. They made it to the Hopi village of Oribe in November of 1776. Before they reached that village, they were so low on food and supplies that they had to eat their own horses. And then they sort of limped back into Santa Fe on January 2nd of 1777. That's when they arrived back in Santa Fe, having not made it all the way to California. Spaniards simply didn't know a lot about this region. And so the maps that resulted from this expedition did prove important, and the route that they traveled became part of the old Spanish Trail. But again, this is a short-lived affair that involved a small number of people, although it did have importance for future expeditions that would come in the decades that followed. So that is the Domínguez-Escalante expedition. A larger expedition in scale was that of Juan Bautista de Anza in 1775 to 76. That was actually his second expedition. He made a first in 1774, which was a relatively small group, but larger than the Domínguez-Escalante expedition. And this one in 1775 to 76, the goal was to colonize Alta California and the Bay Area. The previous expedition had been tasked with mapping a route that would go from Tubac Presidio and reach Monterey, California, and that's what they did. And so then they decided that they would have a larger expedition which would colonize. And so you see that depicted on the left in this image, a fairly large party leaving the Tubac Presidio on its way to colonize Alta California. That Anza expedition party included nearly 250 colonists. These were soldiers and their wives, and over 100 children. There were others, civilians and laborers, and even servants, as well as indigenous guides. They traveled through a significant portion of what's now southern Arizona, coming from Sonora to the south, and they crossed the Colorado River at Yuma Crossing, which is one of the only places where you can safely cross for hundreds of miles. And then they made their way north through California. The Anza party reached what became San Francisco on June 27th of 1776. So during this important year that's going on to the east with the United States. Eventually, this led to the establishment of a mission and a presidio or fort at San Francisco. And this is something that's remembered by the descendants of the Anza party, those original colonists. And a lot is made of the importance of this expedition because it leads to the colonization of the Bay Area, and it's this important historical event for them, and many people remember it, and that their ancestors were part of this party. There's the Anza Trail, which goes from Sonora all the way through Arizona and into California. There's commemoration. There's been a lot written about this expedition. So it was larger and it was more consequential than the Domínguez-Escalante expedition. But I want to point out that it was disastrous for the California indigenous people. The native Ohlone people who lived around the Bay Area were fairly welcoming of the Spaniards, but for them it proved disastrous in terms of disease and demands made on them for their labor and being forced to live in the missions and the bad treatment that they received there. So, there were negative consequences to this as well. Here's a map of the route that they followed. So as you can see, they went through a significant portion of southern Arizona, then traveled west, crossed the Colorado River, and then went north and eventually ended up there in the Bay Area. Those are the two expeditions that happened right at the time of the Declaration of Independence in 1776. And so you can see that there were some pivotal events going on right then at the exact moment that the United States is declaring its independence from Great Britain. The last thing that I want to talk about is the so-called Apaches de Paz, or the Peace Apaches. And this is something that relates directly to my research. As Janie said at the beginning during my introduction, I'm working on a book that looks at former Yavapai and Apache scouts who served in the U.S. Army and then their later lives and what they did when they returned home to their communities and went on with civilian life. A lot of people look to that period in the 1870s and 80s. They look at the Apache Scouts and they're sort of the stuff of legend. And George Crook is generally credited with initiating that system of using Apache Scouts. As the saying went, you could only find an Apache by using an Apache to track him down. But there are earlier antecedents to this. In particular, this guy who's pictured here to the right, Bernardo de Galvez, he was a career Spanish soldier in the military, had fought Indians, had fought also on the European mainland, and then famously during the American Revolution, he had supported the Patriots of the United States. While he was in Louisiana, he made it so that only French, Spanish, and American ships could be on the Mississippi River, and this allowed supplies and goods and money and war materials to be funneled to the Patriot cause, and they made their way to, Washington's army and other armies. And this was invaluable support for the Americans. So Galvez is directly supporting the United States during this difficult time during the American Revolution. Later on, he is sent to sort of help with this situation that's going on in that region of northern New Spain, where for decades, perhaps even longer, Apaches had been battling against Spaniards. And Spaniards had taken many Apaches killed many others, had taken many Apaches captive and killed many others. They had transported hundreds, perhaps thousands of Apache captives to the Mexican interior, where they became slaves or servants in Mexican households. Many others were transported all the way to Cuba, where they were used as laborers there on plantations and in hard manual labor. Many were sent to mines in New Spain, where they worked and died. So many Apaches were taken from their homelands during this time that, historian Paul Conrad has referred to this as the Apache diaspora. And it was a really difficult time for Apaches in what's now northern New Spain. So Galvez was an experienced fighter and an Apache fighter. He knew the costs of this decades-long conflict. And so when he got there and was tasked with subduing Apaches, he issued some statements on how they were to be dealt with. And these are his words. He wrote, "War must be waged without intermission in all the provinces and at all times against the Apaches who have declared it. They must be sought out in their rancherias because it is the only method of punishing them and the only one by which we may be able to achieve the pacification of the territories." But he said, once their, quote, incessant campaigns produce desired results of intimidating and disheartening the Indians to such a degree that one or more of the Apache groups sue for peace, it should be conceded to them immediately under definite rules and points of capitulation. He decided that those who would make peace, instead of endlessly fighting, they would try to lure Apaches and bring them in through a system of payments, essentially. They would pay them to make peace. He said, I'm very much in favor of the special ruination of the Apaches and endeavoring to interest the other tribes and even other Apache bands in it, because these Indians are our enemies in the provincias internas. They cause its desolation and are the most feared because of their knowledge, cunning, warlike customs, acquired in the necessity of robbing in order to live, and their number. So the reason I say that is because this was not some he didn't have these noble intentions. He was not doing this out of charity or out of the goodness of his heart. He just decided, well, we can fight them and continue fighting them endlessly, or we can try to find a way also to those who are interested in making peace, getting them to live in perpetual peace by paying them off, essentially. It was more costly to fight them than to supply them or buy peace, as it were. So, under this system, Apaches who made peace were given weekly rations of corn, cigarettes, salt, and beef, as well as other supplies. Apache leaders were empowered to administer justice in their own communities as long as the offenses involved didn't involve Spaniards. Apaches were also not required to become Catholics under this system. They could maintain their own spiritual traditions. This was not a mission system. But they were required to live next to Spanish forts or presidios. And these were called establecimientos de paz, or peace establishments, and the Apaches who agreed to live there were called peace Apaches. It was expected, like I said, that they would stay there, they would relocate from the countryside and live in these establishments. And this went a long way in making peace and ensuring peace with some Apache groups. Now, if this sounds familiar to the reservation system in the United States, that's because there is some similarity. But it wasn't as simple as settling at a peace establishment and receiving rations and perpetually living off of the Spanish dole. That's not what this was. Like I said, Spain expected things of Apaches, and Apaches expected things of Spaniards as well. For example, the rules that Spain implemented were Apaches could only travel a limited distance from the peace establishments unless they had some sort of special passport. They weren't allowed to raid or attack Spanish communities or soldiers in any manner. Women and children were also expected to work around the presidios and be paid wages for their work. Apaches weren't allowed to travel to Chihuahua City and air their grievances with Spanish provincial officials there. And any Apaches taken in campaigns would not automatically be returned to their people. So this system put Apaches who agreed to live in it under certain pressures and expectations. For their part, Apaches treated this as a way to gain supplies, to live in relative peace after decades of conflict with Spaniards and other indigenous groups, their auxiliaries. And they took advantage of it as much as they could. They often also did not stay at the peace establishments as was required. They left. They still continued, some of them, raiding other Spanish communities and indigenous communities who were allied with Spaniards. For their part, the Jesuit missionaries, or after the Jesuit expulsions, the Franciscan missionaries who were there were dumbfounded that Spain would agree to this. One Franciscan father named Diego Bringas wrote, "The Apaches were permitted to settle outside the presidios every week at your Majesty's expense. They were given a ration of maize, meat, tobacco, and sweets. They were left the free use of their Gentile customs, especially polygamy." He was shocked that Spaniards would agree to this and that captives taken by Apaches years before were not taken away from them. And that they were, quote, permitted the use of weapons and are allowed to take them everywhere. Even the theft of beasts from the residence of travelers is tolerated. Many of them are permitted to possess and use firearms. So for some, the peace establishment system was just far too lenient or a step too far, because they believed that Apaches were irredeemable, that they were barbarous, that they were terrible. But like I said, for Apaches who had been suffering from warfare, from an indigenous slave trade, from decades of difficulty, this provided an opportunity at relative peace for a period. Um, those who lived at peace establishments, importantly, were also expected to provide soldiers and engage in Spanish campaigns against renegade Apaches or other non-allied indigenous groups. And so during this time, from the 1780s through the 1830s, while the system lasted, there were a number of Apache scouts. Just like the scouts who would come in the 1870s and the 1880s, nearly a decade later, they fought for the Spanish military. Um, by the 1780s, there were numerous peace establishments. The Janos Presidio, in particular, between 800 and 900 Apaches lived right there in the vicinity. And the bulk of the peace Apaches were Chiricahua or Southern Apaches and Mescaleros, but there were also Lipans, Eastern Apaches, and Western Apaches who participated in this system, although in smaller numbers. Those who became scouts, some of them were trusted members of the Spanish military and relied upon for intelligence and also for engaging in combat with other groups. One was an Apache by the name of, he was known to Spaniards as El Compa, and he acted as a go-between and an auxiliary and leader for Apaches and Spaniards. He lived at the Janos Presidio, and he didn't just live in the vicinity, he lived within the walls of the Presidio in a Spanish-style home. Two of his sons were baptized and christened with Spanish names. One of his sons went, Juan Jose Compa, was Juan Diego and Juan Jose, one of them was educated at the Presidial School with the officers' children, which was unusual at the time, and he became literate and wrote a series of letters. And they carried on in the leadership role when their father, El Compa, passed away. This system lasted for several decades. Mexico continued it on after it became an independent nation in 1821, but Mexico had, lots of political chaos and an inability to provide the supplies that kept Apaches at the peace establishments. And so it ultimately fell apart and collapsed. But for those decades that it was in place, it mirrored a U.S. reservation system where indigenous peoples were supplied with rations, and then also Apaches provided scouts for the military. And you would see some similarities in the latter part of the 19th century. So those are the three things that I wanted to talk about today. And I think that there are a couple points that we need to make as we think about their meaning. One is to remember, when I showed you that map, the line of Spanish settlement in Arizona ended at Tucson. And this meant that during the era of the American Revolution, what's now Arizona was overwhelmingly indigenous. It was under indigenous control. And while life had changed for a lot of those groups, and there was an influx of goods from the outside and disease, and there was instability, they carried on as much as they could in their traditional life ways. And for many of these people, life continued to a great extent in the way that it had before Spaniards had come to this territory. So that's one thing to remember. Another is that these expeditions that came through Arizona, they didn't result in significant settlement in Arizona in the immediate future. That just didn't happen. It wasn't until the United States took over this region after the war with Mexico that settlement north of Tucson began in earnest, and that really doesn't happen until the 1750s, 60s, and beyond, or 1850s and 60s and beyond. And then the last thing to remember, that system of the peace Apaches and the peace establishments, Spain is dealing with a lot of the same problems that the United States will confront when it encounters Apache peoples and Yavapai peoples as well in Arizona. And it will try to use them and those people as scouts in their military efforts against Apaches and Yavapais. So this is, just a sort of broad glimpse of things that are going on in Arizona during the era of the American Revolution. There's a lot more that we could discuss. This is not meant to be an exhaustive discussion of everything that was going on at that time, but it provides sort of a snapshot of some aspects of the history of Arizona during the Revolutionary era. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer questions now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Crandall. I have a question while we're waiting for a couple
Yeah.
more to come into the Q&A, and that is that I know that you have given, a version of this talk and you're working on your research.
Mhm.
What in your experience is kind of the typical reaction to these histories? I think that, so many of us, so much of the public, they get a very kind of 13 colonies. I will amend that 12 colonies because not a lot of Florida kind of deep South stuff.
Mm.
Um, people, how do people respond to these kinds of stories?
Yeah, it's so it's hard when we're talking about the 250th anniversary or things that commemorate events that happen thousands of miles away to think whether there are reverberations here directly. And one of those direct reverberations is the guy who comes to this region and is tasked with subduing Apaches, had been directly involved in the American Revolution. I mean, Galvez is a direct participant. He actually fought against British forces in the South during the American Revolution, and then he's here fighting Apaches. And so there's a direct linkage there. But it's hard I think it's difficult even for me to see, okay, there direct connections. Um, I think that, most people can see that this is a period in which indigenous peoples in particular are having to confront colonial expansion. So that's happening in the 13 colonies that become states. They're confronting indigenous peoples as colonists that want to expand over the Appalachians and into, these new territories that will become states. There's always this question of indigenous people, their homelands, their attempts at defending those. And so you see some of those same phenomena occur here. And so that's where we can see similarities, I think, occurring to the east and to this place. Um, Also, though, I would say that sometimes there can be a nostalgia for like the Spanish past and that Spanish colonial era and the mission era. This happens with New Mexico, to some extent here with Arizona, but also with California. There are people who look back at the Anza expedition and the colonization that occurs there and look at it very nostalgically. This is a noble, nostalgic past. For the people who lived in the missions, it was difficult. And the demands that were made of indigenous peoples to change their life ways and to adopt a different religion, a different culture, obviously, but many of them didn't like that and fought against it. And so, I think I would hope that people would come to the realization that this wasn't an idyllic past. We might, while one might be interested in the Spanish mission past and the Spanish colonial past in a place like Arizona, it wasn't good for everyone, and it wasn't even good for the Spaniards who lived in those mission communities in many instances or at Presidios. Life was hard. This is the far northern frontier, and it's a rough life, and it wasn't good for a lot of people involved, but in particular for indigenous peoples. And it's hard for indigenous peoples like myself and others to be nostalgic about that past. I don't find a lot to be nostalgic about. And in fact, I would rather highlight those who tried to fight for indigenous freedom and continue freedom struggles against colonizers. I think there's more to be celebrated there, in my opinion.
So one of the questions that has come in is about Galvez, who
Uh-huh.
is a very interesting kind of complicated
Yeah.
figure.
Yeah.
And so this question kind of is thinking about Galvez and kind of Spanish authority, and what is the kind of the crown's reaction to Galvez's plan,
Hmm.
um, and then of course how does that relate to kind of his earlier earlier relations that he built in Louisiana.
Yeah. Um, so Galvez is, like I said, he's an experienced soldier, he's an experienced administrator, he's an experienced Indian fighter, and he's an experienced diplomat. He treats with the Americans during the Revolutionary War. They ally with the Americans. So he is a multifaceted person. His Indian policy and somewhat adaptable, I think, as well, because his Indian policy when he's governor of Louisiana is not the same as his Indian policy in northern New Spain, Sonora, Arizona, etc. Um, One of the things, though, is not to make too much of Galvez's direct influence. He dies after only 2 years being in office, and he had replaced his father, who had died after 2 years in office, and so um, his rule in this region is not particularly long. And so it's to those who follow after him to sort of continue this policy of peace establishments and trying to find allies among Apaches and use them militarily, etc. So while he's a complicated figure, he also is directly involved here in Arizona, and this region only for a couple of years. So I think that that's a point that needs to be made. He dies relatively quickly. Lifespan wasn't what it is now back then, and people died for various reasons. Illness. Yeah, you could drink the wrong water, and people didn't know back then, boil your water or anything like that. So people died somewhat easily at those times, and Galvez is one of them. But I think that he is an important character, and his influence, extends from previous period dealing with various colonial forces and outside nation states like France and Great Britain, and then the United States in Louisiana, along the Mississippi, and on the Gulf Coast even, and then into Arizona, where the calculus is a little bit different, but he's somebody that maybe shows himself to be adaptable in some ways. But he's an interesting character. Yeah.
So a couple more questions.
Yeah.
One is specifically looking at the Pima Revolt, or the uprising.
Yeah.
Is there a spiritual component to that, kind of like the Pontiac's Rebellion, or maybe not so much?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And that connection to indigenous uprisings that take place in the wake of the French and Indian War and throughout the Revolutionary era to the east. You have like Pontiac and Neolene, Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa. There's often like a military leader and then a spiritual leader, and in conjunction, there's like the military side, and then there's a spiritual aspect. I would say this, for O'odham people and for indigenous peoples in general, there isn't like a division of church and state as we would have today. So one of the things that O'odhams were confronting in Arizona is that there is a power struggle between secular Spanish authorities and missions. They each want control of indigenous labor and resources, and so they're continually combating, and indigenous people are in the middle of that. And that's a story that runs throughout the Spanish colonial era, that there is always conflict between secular and religious authorities because there's sort of this separation of the two. Whereas within indigenous societies, these are often, like we might call them theocracies, where religious leaders have authority within the community. They're important figures, and they're called upon to make decisions. And life is imbued with a spiritual aspect. And so, whatever actions you would undertake as a warrior would be in conjunction with consulting with medicine people and having their blessing and going through going through ceremonies and things that would try to ensure success in battle. And so I think that there's a spiritual aspect built into the O'odham freedom struggle that's going on there. I'm not aware of there being like a specific, sort of like Neolene figure or Tenskwatawa figure who was the religious leader. But you can see spiritual aspects to this, like in the fact that Luis of Sarric, who was leading this entire rebellion, tells O'odham peoples to go to the Babukivari Mountains. I mean, that's the spiritual homeland of O'odham people. The cave where Itoi, their creator God, lives is there in those mountains. And so there has to be a connection there. They're going to a safe and sacred place. And so I think that there's a spiritual element that runs through all of this that's important to point out. And that's a great question. I think that there wasn't necessarily a separation between the spiritual and the secular within that society, that they were all part of life and warfare as well.
So the last question, which I think is a really good one to end on, is okay, now we're all fired up and we want to know more. Are there other individuals or other resources out there for people who really want to dive into this time period?
Yeah, there are. I don't know that, there's not a book obviously called like Revolutionary Arizona. What happened in Arizona during this period? Um, there are a number of works, articles in particular on the Pima Revolt, mostly academic articles. There's, like I said, there's a lot of writing on the Anza expedition and, websites dedicated to it. There's the Anza Trail that a lot of people follow and commemorate by traveling along that trail. The Domínguez-Escalante as well. There was several years back, there was a a very interesting book that I saw. It was sort of like a coffee table book that had photographs of areas that the Dominguez Escalante expedition had traveled. And so what it looks like, a lot of that is still what we would consider wild wilderness area, like remote areas that they traveled through. Um, there is quite a bit of literature. There are books on the Peace Apaches. Matt Babcock's book, which is Apache Adaptation to Hispanic Rule, talks about Peace Apaches, but also Apache people confronting Spanish colonialism. There's Lance Blythe's book, which is about the Janos Presidio and Chiricahuas and those dealings over a long period. And there's Paul Conrad's book, The Apache Diaspora, which looks at ways in which during the colonial era, but all the way through the late 19th century and into the 20th, Apache peoples are taken from their homelands and transported to faraway places. I mean, even up to Geronimo and his people being transported to Florida, to Fort Marion, and then they go to Alabama and eventually end up in Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where the Fort Sill Apache tribe still is to this day. So yeah, there are resources to look at. There's one thing that I didn't talk about, the establishment of Tucson Presidio in 1775. This is right at the same time. There are works on that. That's an important event that's happening and consequential to the history of what will become Arizona, as Tucson is the first really important city, non-indigenous community within Arizona. So there's work on that. There are works on those mission communities, those O'odham mission communities, in particular by John Kessel, the historian. He wrote about the Gevavi mission and Tumacacori and things that are going on there in the 18th century and up through this period. So yes, there are lots of resources. Yeah, and you're welcome to email me, and I'm happy to send along some titles and point you in the direction of any resources that I am aware of.
Well, Dr. Crandall, thank you so much for taking the time out of your afternoon to spend it with us. Great presentation. Thank y'all in the audience for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye.